All right. Well, hello, everybody. We're so glad to have you here today. Very, very excited to partner with the Native American and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. My name is Christina Clayton. I am one of the co-directors of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And today's webinar is just we're so humbled and grateful that Raymond Dawe is here to present on cultural elements with a focus on rural mental health. I'm going to briefly breeze by our introductory slides because there are a lot of things that Ray is going to cover. And so we want to make sure we have as much time for you as possible. If you haven't heard of us before, we are based in Seattle. We are part of a national network, and we have an area of focus of serious mental health issues and evidence-based practices, but we train on a lot of different topics. We do newsletters, webinars, learning communities. We have online courses. So if you want to get in touch with us, we will put in how you can do that later in the chat. But we're very excited to be here today. We also have a language slide because our network really wanted to encourage all events to remind folks that we're always mindful of using language that promotes recovery and culturally appropriate terminology. We know for many, this is still a learning curve. And so we just ask that you have this spirit in mind to foster dignity and hope for folks. Some housekeeping issues. Just wanted to share is a very large audience. We have over 200, as you can see, people right now. So you're muted, you're not appearing on video. This presentation, though, is being recorded. And so the recording and slides will be available later in a couple of weeks, if not sooner. And you'll receive an email from Zoom showing where we keep those. So you can click to that and give it a week or two, and then you'll see those resources there. We also don't have formal CEUs, but we do have certificates of attendance. So if you are interested in that, you'll receive an email from us as well about how you can access that. Today, because it's a webinar, we are able to have both chat and Q&A features. And so the chat is really, now I'm going to see, I haven't looked at the chat because I've been busy, but I see we have, 94 things in the chat. So that's why it's really important, if you can, to please put any content questions for Ray in the Q&A box or part of the Zoom toolbar there. Because if you're having tech issues or you need assistance from our team, we have a few of us on today, you want to say hi or where you're from, that's a perfect place to put in the chat. But for questions, I will be looking at those throughout the presentation. And so if you have something, Ray has been gracious enough to say that if there's something related to content he's sharing at the moment, if you throw that question in the Q&A, I can pop back on camera and let him know that we have a question. So please do put those content questions in the Q&A. We can't copy and paste it from the chat. So sorry, that's just a glitch in Zoom, but we will also get to questions at the end, depending on time. This is just a preview. We'll share this at the end, but we might throw the link. We're going to try something different. I know a number of folks can't always stay till the end of a given webinar. So we want to make sure you know that your feedback is very important to us. It's something we look at, we share with presenters. It's anonymous, confidential, but you can either do the link that we'll put in the chat now, so you can just have it ready, so in case you have to duck out, or you can ideally do it when it's over, but we just want to thank you ahead of time. We really value your work. Should take 2 minutes, but SAMHSA, who is our funder, requires it, but it's nice for us to get your feedback as well. So today, wanted to introduce Mr. Raymond Dawe. He is of the Navajo Nation. He is a member and is bilingual in Navajo and English. He's a trainer and web designer. He has worked on historical trauma and intervention models. He formerly worked as the administrator of behavioral health in Alaska, in Bethel, and he's also done a number of things with research trials and working with the University of New Mexico. I will let him do a longer introduction for himself because he knows the information better, and it's pretty astute. So we'll let him do that. But we wanted to just say thank you, Ray, for being here. And I'm so excited to have a conversation with you. And just we're so grateful that you were able to be with us today. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then we will have a little bit of conversation. So welcome, Ray. Welcome to everybody who's here. Very excited. So when we talked about, so for those that don't know, I mean, obviously Ray works with the, mental health TTC with the Native American Alaska Native Center, but also with other training centers through the University of Iowa. And so when we talked about this topic of both cultural considerations, which is a huge ask in our needs assessment. And so just want to make sure you understand, especially those of you from Region 10, that we listened and we are planning around what you shared you wanted to see from our needs assessment this past year. But also we know rural mental health is a huge topic that we don't have enough attention paid, I think, to. And so what I want to lead with as we have our conversation, Ray, is just not making assumptions. I think that was on my mind, is that I don't want to make assumptions about any of this. So if I make a mistake, please forgive me in how I word things, or if I offend anybody, but I'm really trying to, but let me just start by saying thank you for being here and welcome. And I don't know if you have any just hellos you want to share before we get started.
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, so in that aim of not making assumptions, I think when thinking about, many folks who registered said that they either may work with tribal communities, may not, want to learn more regardless. And I guess, what are some of the things that you have seen, whether tribal or non-tribal provider, that are assumptions around working with tribal people and Native folks? What are those things that people kind of assume or make incorrect judgments or that sort of thing?
I think one of the significant misconceptions about Native American tribal communities, the rural communities, is the thinking that most of Native life on reservations and the rural areas are desperate, and through the work that a number of us do in Indian country, and I've had the pleasure of working across most of the United States with many Native tribes, is a significant degree of hopefulness that exists in all Native American communities, and I think that's a thing that really gives me pleasure, hope, and just a sense of where more and more of our people are moving to. Reflecting on my life in general, 30 years ago, if you went to a native event, invariably you'd see alcohol on premises or within the crowd. Invariably, that was the case. Today's it's not like that. When you go to a Native event these days, invariably it's the opposite of that. It's a sober, clean events. The other thing that has really been good for me to see is how appreciation, involvement, and movement towards including traditional ways into our social life has really increased over the last 10, 20, 30 years, more and more so. And so that's something that I appreciate a lot.
Well, I appreciate your answering that, because I think there is, always the unfortunate pitfall of pathologizing some conditions, some context. And I think it's so important that we understand the strength of original peoples in these lands, and what, survival and resilience, and, but at the same time, not co-opting that. I've heard a lot of people share that over time too, that, you don't want to know enough to then be dangerous or make assumptions because you've worked with, you know,
mhm,
XYZ tribal folks, or you've, worked in one setting. So I really appreciate you sort of sharing what are those things that can happen.
mhm, mhm,
How about for rural context? That
mm,
is something that I'm sure is in the eye of the beholder in some sense,
mm,
that, if you haven't worked in a rural population or community, you may not even, what's the definition of rural? How does rural,
mm,
aspects affect um, the work that you do, or what can folks
yeah.
understand better about
Mm,
what rural means?
mm, mm. Well, we in the United States, about 30% of our people live in rural, uh, the rural parts of the country. So I appreciate that most of our people are in urban communities like Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, New York, New York City and Chicago and places like that. So it's really become incumbent on me to look at understanding um, similarities, difference, and compare and contrast how life is in urban Native communities as well as rural Native communities. And what is rural really changes. I live in northwest New Mexico. From a
Mm,
broad perspective, it's a very rural region. Uh, but from a macro perspective, the town next to me is about 19,000 people, and that makes it urban for me.
yeah.
From New York City, looking at Gallup, New Mexico, you'll see that is a rural community. But from our point of view here in Navajo land, Farmington, Gallup, and the smaller towns that we have compared to the bigger cities are make it less rural. Uh,
Mm,
so 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 that makes it different. Rural for me is when I go back to my home community, which is 30 miles down the road, and I have families living half a mile, 2 miles apart. And some areas of our country are uninhabited. There's a swath of land near where I live, probably 20 miles square, that has nobody in it.
mm,
You know, to me, that's rural. And I appreciate that because it gives
mhm,
a lot of us opportunity to do things in a real rural context that is
mhm,
helpful for me and healthier.
mhm.
So,
Well, and I appreciate that. I think,
mm,
again, like you mentioned, within the tribal context, in the rural context, there are such strengths and resilience
mhm,
that we may not always jump to when we're thinking about, and I know you'll be talking about this, is health shortages for workers, and as
mhm,
folks are noting, logistics, just getting to and around for services or to support others. So there's always a challenge, and yet, those vast expanses of area make it just
mm,
more challenging. And yet there's a connection too that I think people may not appreciate, or how rural is rural, as you said. That's
yeah,
a large
yeah,
city to me, and yet to someone else.
mhm,
So perspective is also, always very important. I
mhm,
appreciate that.
mhm,
Speaking of, I know a lot of our audience isn't necessarily from our region, which
mm,
includes Alaska, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, and Region 10. What can you share? What lessons have you learned, or insights might you share about our region or any particular state? We can't go through the whole nation, but at least these 4 states for our Region 10 folks and
mm,
listeners.
mm. Well, the 4 states that you guys work in are pretty diverse in themselves. I mean, I've had I've had the experience of driving from Portland to a couple of reservations out there and seeing how spread out things are. I've also been in Southwest Alaska where you get around by airplane. That's about it. Um, and so I think in the lower 48, we take the liberty we have to be more mobile, driving from point A to point B, whether it's 5 miles or 200 miles, for granted. Uh, and I think that's a big thing for me in terms of how your area is. Uh, and the some reservations in your region are closer to urban communities than like in the Southwest or where I'm at. The nearest community, the nearest quote unquote city to where I'm at is about 240 miles away in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which has a population of about 300,000. Uh, so from that understanding, it is different in terms of how your region is
Mhm.
located. Um, but
Yeah, transportation, as you mentioned.
yeah,
Car isn't
transportation.
always an option.
No, not in some parts of remote Alaska. You know, remote Alaska is quite a bit different from where many of us come from, and so having come back from that context in Alaska, I really come to appreciate how much freedom I have to move around. So I get teased a lot that I'm often in my car. And there's a reason for that. I love the scenery.
Right.
I love the freedom that I have these days that I didn't have for a number of years when I was in remote Alaska.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we could talk for days and I would still just barely scratch the surface, I think, of the wisdom you're going to share. Um, here's a question that I know has been on a lot of people's minds who reached out
Mm,
to us is with regards to keeping, and respecting the native perspective and views on healing and, the challenges that communities face, but also the strengths within
mm,
communities. What do providers, especially non-native or non-tribal providers, because that's definitely at least half of who registered
mm,
today, and a lot of folks said they want to learn more. So
yeah.
with giving you the impossible question of what do maybe especially those that want to overcome the biases, that overcome the oppression, the racism. I mean, we can't undo history certainly, but we want, for those that want to do better, what can
Mm,
we what can folks do to better serve and respect native tribal clients and communities?
yeah. Well, that all depends on where the native uh, person is from.
Mhm.
Uh, there's
Right.
essentially three broad models of helping people. One is a treatment model, which is which is where a lot of us are grounded from. You know, I'm a trained clinician from myself, but we also have a recovery model. You know, that's there, and oftentimes they end up being overlapping, but nonetheless, it's there. But a third model that many of us in Native country really hone in on is a healing model, a healing approach, and for good, bad, or whatever. Sometimes, oftentimes, all three get clumped in together. Treatment is recovery, recovery is healing, healing is treatment. It's not necessarily so. And so, when we hear discussions about decolonization, for example, and for many non-Native Americans, that's a turnoff because decolonization, the term decolonization, comes across as being abrasive, uh, disrespectful, even racist sometimes. But from the context of healing, decolonization is a gateway and a gateway towards our identity and our well-being and formation of healthy relationships with everybody and anybody. And that's where that word becomes very important to many of us. And the pleasure that I have is seeing how many of our young people these days have in their discussions uh, that phrase decolonization as a way to move forward. But unfortunately, some of course, naturally, um, some folks take decolonization as in a confrontative, abrasive manner to uh, sometimes create relationships that are not healthy and wise and good for all of us. So I would answer you that way.
Well, thank you. I think, like many other atrocities, then when we have to face them and think how to do better and keep that stuff in mind, it is difficult, right? It's difficult to process and appreciate and even be aware. I mean, if you haven't been educated on all the history that's in this country, around Native and tribal communities and what's been done, and then trying to go in, you get overwhelmed. And so I really appreciate this discussion. We will let you take it from here. And thank you. Ray, thank you so much for stopping to pause and have this opening conversation. I really appreciate it. So we'll let thank you. And I'm going to go off camera and let us we'll get to your slides. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for some of you. It looks like we have people as far away as New York joining us this morning or this afternoon. And I want to welcome you. This is a reiteration of the title that we're working on today. Go ahead, next slide. And we have some introductory slides. As mentioned before, I'm affiliated with the University of Iowa's Native Center for Behavioral Health, and where I do much of my consultation work these days. But this is an intro slide. And I believe these slides will be made available to you later on. Go ahead. In Native country, as part of our decolonization process, we wish to acknowledge that our lands exist still to us, and we have colleagues, allies, relatives who reside with us on lands that are traditional to us, And so this is a way of acknowledging that we all share a space in this world, this continent, especially that had been home to millions and millions of people prior to colonization. And this land acknowledgement piece is developed out of the University of Iowa by 3 Native people who are there. Thank you. Next one. And as a part of the Native Center for Behavioral Health, this is a map that we show to display how we are linked in with all the other regional centers across the country, including the Northwest ATTC. We strive to collaborate closely with each other, and that given this opportunity to be here with you all is a real prime example of that. Thank you. Our time today is supported by SAMHSA. As a longtime SAMHSA affiliate, we deeply appreciate this opportunity to be with you through the funding and support of SAMHSA in and of itself. And the other thing is that the content that I'm going to go through they're basically my opinions and don't reflect the policies of SAMHSA, Health and Human Services, or the American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health TTC. Thank you. Well, this is me pre-pandemic. The previous picture you saw earlier was my pandemic selfie. We're all masking up mostly these days, I think, and this is how life is with us. But I'm Diné from Navajo. Diné is our word for ourselves. We are the people from our region. And I live on the Nemesco side of Navajo land, the Nepakea. And I'm work as a behavioral health consultant independently. Decided to take some time off from working 8 to 5, or like a lot of you do, probably 10, 12-hour days. And my work is primarily around the Navajo Nation, but I've had experience to work with many Native nonprofits and tribes across our country. And emphasis of a lot of my learning is around development and advocating for Native-centric approaches that are healing and effective across the gamut of behavioral health services, prevention, intervention, and treatment. I'm one of those who believe that if I'm going to do treatment well, I also need to learn prevention and do prevention well. So that's where I come from. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. For my the relative shikeda no sliniki kui the don't nan sliniki kui abka shikia aninch aro tlasatlana bashin chin sana jini da shiche to the jini da shanada. And the formal Navajo way of identifying ourselves, these are my 4 clans that I introduced. My mother's clan is Tarawing House Kiani. My father's clan is Menigos Tlazatlana. And my maternal grandfathers are Tsanachini or Blackstreet people. And my paternal grandfathers are Twitachini, Bitterwater people. And this is who I am. That's who I am as a Navajo man and a father, grandfather, and elder, and whatever the labels come along with that. But that's who I am. And we'll touch on this later on in one of the slides around identity. Go ahead. So we have 3 objectives. One is to provide an overview of United States rural mental health disparities, and number 2, to provide an overview of Native American mental health disparities. And the third part, which is going to be the body of our discussion, is to describe cultural elements for improving rural mental health. Go ahead. Thank you. So the first objective, we'll go ahead and move into the content here. Go ahead. Thank you. There's a link here from the United States Census Bureau. And basically, our country, the United States, it's kind of self-evident there that our urban areas make up only 3% of the entire land, but have 3% of our land in the United States contains within it 80% of the population. It's kind of similar to now, Indian country. In Indian country, 70% of our population are in these urban areas. So we're almost there. So this is some information. So we have a lot of our land which is considered rural in the United States. Go ahead. And there are some challenges that we have that if you're working in rural communities from anywhere in the United States, you'll identify with these 4 challenges that are identified by the National Rural Health Association. And there are great resources to explore the meaning, impact, and even solution towards these 4 challenges that we face in rural mental health services. Accessibility, availability, affordability, and acceptability are specific to what we have particular concerns about. Next slide. A major challenge for us is the basically lack of staffing or quote unquote professionals who are available to our people in rural communities. And this is an interesting map that shows where a lot of the gaps exist, and the challenge that our centers for higher learning, like universities, colleges, technical schools, have towards beginning to fill in these gaps. We have a long ways to go, and I think there's a long process. And I think these gaps have really been even more evident to us during the 2 years that we've been living in the pandemic. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the stresses related to the pandemic, this map has certainly begun to change as more of our health providers and behavioral health providers are beginning to leave their work and going into other endeavors. So this is something to relate to in our discussions about how to begin filling in these gaps. Next slide, please. We have, even though rural populations make up far, we're not in the same numbers as urban population, but what I appreciate about this slide is showing that an example of mental health disparity. Our suicide rate in rural contexts are quite a bit higher, and that's that line that shows up on top compared to these other areas that we live in. The solid line is the United States average of all of the above. So we have quite a bit of work to do because of our isolated situations in rural United States and the challenges that we have around access and things like that. So this is a good mapping of how far we still have to go to get to that center point in the suicide rates across the country. Next, please. What I'd like to ask here is a question that you can address in chat. Is how has the pandemic impacted mental health in rural communities? And then I'd like to ask a couple of you, if you feel like raising your hand, to respond to this question by getting unmuted. What's been the impact of the pandemic on mental health in our rural communities? Anyone would like to talk to that?
Well, I work in prevention, so it's been pretty tough. We're seeing an increase in suicide rates and substance use. And in prevention work, I haven't been able to do a lot of direct contact as much as I would like. I work with youth, and so that's been a little bit of kind of a challenge.
I can hear that.
Yeah.
Very much concerned around the impact of social isolation, especially upon prevention work. I think we have three other here. Go ahead, Gabriella. Go ahead, Letterman.
Hi, my name is Jessie. I am in Juneau, Alaska. And one of the things that's actually been a benefit that I've seen is the state of Alaska is more tolerant, I guess, of telehealth. And so it's still not officially allowed outside of the pandemic, but we've made a really good sort of cry to allow this so that there is some level of resource, although it's still not ideal. We're able to provide phone or Zoom therapy and services to families in remote communities.
Yeah, I think you're right about the more widespread use of telebehavioral health services, and the Alaska approach has been always a significant model to develop from, and I think many parts of the United States are adapting accordingly. Next person, please.
Hi, my name's Tasha, and I'm a care coordinator in Northwest Oregon. And I would say that in our community, prior to the pandemic, being rural, I know that families have had difficulty accessing transportation to appointments or childcare, so that they can, be able to not have like that, distraction during appointments or supporting like one of their children. Since this pandemic, I know that a lot of homes have been struggling with adequate internet services to be able to utilize telehealth services or to be able to do the distance learning. And distance learning in general has caused a lot of stress and has greatly impacted our families who are navigating that. And so there's just been kind of, some solutions with telehealth, and then some barriers for families.
That's very true. And I think, although we've made a little bit of progress on that, in some parts of rural United States, we still have quite a bit of work to do around broadband access, let alone wired access through data lines and things like that. But you're right about that. And I think I personally hope that Congress makes that access to internet more available to more of our rural communities. We'll take one more comment and then we'll move on. Thank you.
So I was going to talk about how we just don't have access to the broadband in so many of our areas. The other challenge would be the lack of housing to draw our staff there. We're losing so many staff during this pandemic, and then trying to replace those with folks coming into areas where housing isn't even available for them to access or even to afford.
Yeah, I think the pressure on what you're describing, I think makes it valuable to look at how we can improve our manpower availability through work like peer support modeling, and as a way to begin to meet some of that gap that's there. But I definitely see that on Navajo land as well. In New Mexico, we're seeing many of our teachers leave, and they're bringing in others to work as substitute teachers to try to meet that gap. So those are some of the adaptations being made. But thank you for your comments, and I see a lot of comments in chat too that are really helpful. So thank you. Next slide, please. Here we're going to look at an overview of Native American mental health disparities. Go ahead. So as I mentioned before, about 70% of American Indians, Alaska Natives live in urban areas, with 25% of our people residing in counties that are served by urban Native health programs. And here's a link and a reference for us to look at later on. Go ahead. Native American health and behavioral health are impacted by a couple of things. One is acculturation. All of us have acculturated lives towards the Euro-American process. And we kind of move in and out of that acculturation process each day. When I'm sitting in a ceremony on Navajo land at 3 a.m, then I'm very acculturated towards the Navajo way of doing things, but less acculturated to the Euro-American process. On the other hand, when I'm meeting with colleagues on a research advisory board, for example, then my acculturation shifts towards that mindset, that way of thinking, and that way of understanding. And so acculturation is always in flux, I think, ever changing. And our behaviors and our beliefs are reflected accordingly. When I'm sitting in a ceremony at night, Navajo ceremonies, we sit on the ground, and we don't sit in chairs. But on the other hand, when I'm when I would go to an urban meeting somewhere, everybody's sitting around a big table and sitting in pretty nice chairs that way. And so you end up adapting that way. But acculturation is an important thing to understand when we're working with folks who are particularly from rural communities, is looking at how acculturated they are towards the native reservation ways, sometimes traditional ways, and how they are acculturated towards your American ways. And it's not a set point. We all adapt differently. Next slide, please. A second concern from my point of view is assimilation, and how we as Native American and how we as Americans assimilate towards that global Euro-American culture that exists, which is really a hodgepodge of different cultures anyway. But I thought I'd show this slide as an example of how much pressure Native Americans have historically faced towards assimilation. This is a picture taken in the early 1950s on Navajo land, actually, as one of the signs that existed on Navajo land for quite a while in the early 50s. I remember seeing a sign on a video one time that was like probably a 15 by 12 by 6 sign on the middle of a street corner in Window Rock, Arizona, that had these exact same words on it. And people, whether they be on wagon, like in this scene, or whether they be driving on cars, would be seeing these signs all over the place on Navajo land. And this is an example of the pressure of assimilation that we've faced, even in my lifetime. And although we don't see these kinds of things today, nonetheless, the influence on this kind of thinking is still very prominent in many parts of the United States. Next slide, please. Suicide rates again, taking it down from the national data to more Native American specific data. Native American suicide rates in large metropolitan communities is around 14 per 100,000. In small, medium communities, which a lot of Native Americans live in, especially border town communities, suicide death rates are 19.6. When we get to the rural context, like reservations in particular, then our suicide death rates increase to 59.07. There's some Native communities that see suicide death rates that go as high as 55 per 100,000. And so the problems associated with our people taking their lives and creating grief, significant grief, I think is really impactful on this. And the work that some of us do on Native American suicide trends is to really begin to understand the impact of clusters, the clustering of suicide deaths in many parts of Native country, and the influence of poor relationships and lack of identity, on poor identity on these problems that we're seeing with suicide deaths. Go ahead. Health disparities, these are disparities that exist a little more severely or significantly across the Native country. And the thing that captures my attention is that some of these health disparities are quality of life disparities. Diabetes is a good example of that. Obesity, they kind of go together. We have pretty significant homicide deaths and alcohol-related deaths. One of the main drivers of death rates in Indian country are alcohol-related deaths. And we've had long-standing histories of respiratory ailments and infections across in Native country. And these are some of the drivers around some of the other disparities that pop up, like suicide, infant mortality, smoking, prenatal care, and vaccinations. So go ahead, next slide. Mental health disorders in Indian country, Alaska Native also are these three things. We're continually seeing reports of very significant depression rates and high anxiety rates and substance use disorders across rural Native American lands, and they drive how some of our families interact and some of our young people maladapt to what we all hope for them to do, which is to have good quality of lives and a more healthy existence. Next slide, please. Some of the social impacts of behavioral health conditions that just pointed out are these, domestic violence, incarceration. Many of our native lands experienced high infection rates with COVID in the last 2 years, and then here in New Mexico, in some parts of Indian country, some of our lands are still closed off to non-reservation residents as a result of seeing many of our elders and people with other chronic health conditions get very, very sick or not survive COVID. And we've had very high unemployment rates on Navajo land. Our poverty rate is 40%. So 40% of our people on Navajo live at or below poverty levels. And this is kind of similar across many reservations in Indian country and Alaska. Child abuse and unemployment are continue to be drivers around how our societies are impacted and influence our mental well-being. Next slide, please. Trauma. The three things that are mentioned around depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders are influenced by trauma. There have been studies that show that Native Americans appear to experience higher trauma events at a higher rate than the general population. And some of that relates back to what I was talking about around the pressures of assimilation and acculturation, where generations of our people have been taught and told that being Indian is not being a person, a human being, and that dying or being dead is a better option towards being Native American. Next slide. So some of us define trauma this way. Dolores Bigfoot out of the University of Oklahoma developed these 4 ways of defining trauma: cultural trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and present trauma. We're all going through present trauma right now because of the pandemic, and consequently, we're seeing the effects of that. Not only Native country, but across almost all of the United States, we're seeing increases in substance use. Substance use and substance use dependence, and we're seeing increases in violence and unhealthy behaviors that are out there as our cost of living is going up, and we're still adjusting to not being able to socialize the way we did prior to 2020. But these are ways of understanding, defining trauma that you can explore and look at more. Go ahead. And another approach towards understanding trauma, adult trauma, is through the adverse childhood experiences model that has been much talked about and also appreciated within the Center for Disease Control, the CDC definition of adverse childhood experiences. If you're not aware of ACEs, then this is a good way to begin to understand that and how it has impact on all of us, particularly Native country. Going back to the previous slide that shows that Native Americans have higher incidences of trauma in life and at greater severity. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, Dolores Bigfoot out of the University of Oklahoma developed those 4 ways of defining trauma. ACEs has these 3 categories, and there's 3 categories that has these 4 conditions to consider as part of the model. Go ahead. And we're aware now that if your ACEs score goes high, then there's a strong likelihood that you'll have these health conditions in life. And when I compare this to the health disparities that exist in Native country, there's a real strong relationship to them, to these health conditions and the health disparities that are generally described by Indian Health Services and SAMHSA. Next slide, please. And we're aware through the work that's mainly been developed through NIDA that there are some major cognitive impacts and neurological impacts from trauma. Trauma does really change how our brain functions. And I remember Nora Volkov talking about this as early as the late 1990s. And one of the things I appreciate about current research is more of a focus on understanding how trauma is not only that much of how we are behaviorally as we become more, as our lives are more traumatized, can be related back to these kinds of things that happen to our neurotransmitters and our brain cell functioning. Next slide, please. How do we overcome ACEs? Well, a number of ways. Number one, and this is consistent in studies related to healing or recovering from trauma, is that having stable, nurturing relationships can reverse some of the damaging effects of toxic stress and trauma. This is a graphic that was drawn by a Navajo medicine man way back in his understanding of how our relationships begin to develop. We have our nuclear family, and then we have our extended families that are around us to nurture us and to support us. And this is how we understand we can begin to overcome the impact of trauma that occurs to us in our childhood. Next slide, please. I saw a reference to historical trauma earlier, and as a mentee of Maria Braveheart, I really appreciate the work that she's put in towards teaching me and many others about her understanding of her historical trauma. And here's a definition that she and Meyer de Bruin created back in 1998. And the dynamic process that historical trauma creates for all of us, from a dark side and a light side, and how we as human beings work through that in our healing. So that's what this slide tends to convey. Next slide, please. The historical trauma model developed out of understanding out of the different kinds of adverse, traumatic genocidal experiences of people across the world, particularly during the Nazi Holocaust. And unfortunately, we're seeing this played out again in Europe. It's very unfortunate. But the historical trauma model that Maria began working on well over 35 years ago comes from researching, understanding, and relating these experiences to our people here in the United States. Next slide. Historical trauma has been perpetrated by the push towards assimilating and acculturating Native Americans, particularly within the boarding school systems that were prominent across the United States. And this is a map that shows where upwards to 357 boarding schools were operated or run by either churches or Bureau of Indian Affairs previously. There are some boarding schools still open or operating today, but it's not as traumatizing and as when I went to boarding school. Yeah, I have to say that. So next slide. We don't talk about this much, but during colonization, particularly after the landing of Columbus and in the Caribbean area and the landing of Spanish in South America and Central America and the Europeans in the northeast and the Spanish in the southern part of continental United States. This is what happened. 90% of Native Americans who lived in these lands died after contact. And the thing that gets my attention about this is I wonder, I live in a town near a town of 20,000 people, Gallup. And I wonder sometimes how life would be in Gallup, a town of 20,000 people, if 90% of the people that live there passed within 10, 15 years. How would life be? That would mean reducing Gallup's population from 20,000 to 2,000, let's say. And the kind of disruption that would create in a small town like that. And so I think about my ancestors that way and work towards understanding how they survived those very difficult times and create a life that leads to me being here today with you and many of my relatives across Native country. Is one of those underappreciated aspects of colonization, I think, that we don't get much into. And we're going through a pandemic now that has taken lives of quite a few of our relatives across the United States, but not in the same kind of numbers that we experienced early on in colonization. Next slide. It's known through research that trauma is passed through genetically and biologically, and that affects how learning is processed. And it affects how we interact with our environment. It affects how we interact with each other across generation. And that's where the intergenerational aspect of how we are as people, not only Native Americans, but across the world comes in. When I look at the invasion of Ukraine and I look at the children there, and I think, gosh, they're being severely traumatized, and their biology is already being affected this way. And I think about the kinds of young people and adults will end up being, and the amount of healing and the amount of recovery that's going to be needed in that land once that invasion goes away. So I take the historical trauma model and I look at it across the lens of different things that happen in contemporary life across the world. Thank you. Next slide. One of the things that Maria is always reminds me about is, Ray, don't just talk about the trauma. It's important to talk about healing from that trauma. And the historical trauma model does include a way to process through that trauma. One intervention is confronting the trauma, talking about the trauma and embracing that history, accepting that those are things that happened. But then understanding that trauma, what have been the consequences of those traumas that have occurred historically, but also in the present. And then really taking a good look at how we begin to release that pain that we experience from the trauma. How do we begin to heal ourselves? And when we get that part of our work done, then transcending that trauma, being human beings in a way that we care for each other, we support each other, we collaborate with each other, we achieve understanding of each other, and support each other in all the ways that we can, physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually. And once we achieve that, then we have begun to transcend the trauma and begin to be able to be more grounded when we talk about the historical trauma experiences of our people. And so these are the 4 interventions that Maria developed that we don't spend a lot of time looking at and don't have time to look at today, but nonetheless, I wanted to show this to further your learning around historical trauma. Next slide. So I'd like to ask a question. You can put your responses in chat like you did with the other one. But how have healing practices positively influenced families and Native communities? If you have some understanding or experience or thoughts about that, put that in chat. I'd also like to ask a few, maybe 2 or 4 of you that are in the audience to raise your hand, and Gabriella will put you on, unmute you so you can make a comment or 2 about this. Go ahead, Gabriella.
Okay, my name is Sandy Ruiz, and I do Native education for the Hoquiam School District. My experience with my kids, I was able to start doing a high school Native group this year. And at first it was a little discouraging. A lot of them were not comfortable identifying themselves, or at least being in a group with a bunch of other kids they didn't know. They didn't talk very much. Some of them stopped coming. But over the year, as we've done presentations, as we've done crafts, like most recently, the kids just did drum kits. And now I see them socializing together. I see them talking and laughing together. They've built a relationship around the fact that they are all Native students. And it's really powerful to see them come together like that and see these kids who never spoke start to talk and smile and laugh together. I think identifying themselves and finding that identity is very powerful.
Well, thank you for your comment. You're very much in the ballpark with that. I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you. Next, please.
Good morning, Ray. This is Martina.
Oh, Martina.
Hi. One of the things that I learned while we were in Bethel with my first cousin, Alice, what she did with us was, instead of talking about all of the trauma that had happened in our community, one of the things that I loved was how she would turn that trauma and make it into something positive. Thinking about the future, talking about how we can deal with people that are dysfunctional or not a very good person. One of the things that I loved was how she would turn everything positive. And we did so many activities. And I think from the way that she treated me and treated my daughter was what kind of turned the way we were thinking. Instead of thinking of disparities, of negative thoughts, instead we turned it around to about what can we do and how can we heal. And so working from all the way back then to now, a few years ago, I realized that I did break the cycle. And it's also one of the things that I have also been doing is learning about historical trauma, generational, learning about DV, is that it takes a lot of training. And so that is one of the things that I do is doing a lot of training. That way I will be able to share with other people what I learned. And in a way, when I do that, I think about Mayala, how she taught me, and this way I can pass it on to other people and have them. It's a wonderful feeling to see people hear that the trauma that they're going through, the mental health, the issues, and when I let them know that some of the trauma that they're carrying is their own great-grandparents and grandparents. And it is so good to see them with relief. They don't really have to carry it, and they understand where it's coming from, and it's for them to realize it's not just their own. It is really one of the things that I do, and so
Thank you, Martina. Kuyana, Martina, for your teachings to us today. And I come to the conclusion, one of my conclusions, that it's not just my conclusion, but I think a real major consensus in mental health, behavioral health, is the impact of trauma, and how we have to look at trauma from a lot of different lenses. And I believe that anyone working with Native Americans who does not understand, appreciate, and incorporate concepts of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, culture trauma into their management of programs and delivery of behavioral health services, I believe anyone who doesn't do that is negligent and doing a disservice to people in Native country and other communities of color and the world as we face this pandemic. And so I just want to make that comment also. Anyone else? One more comment.
Yeah, Ray,
Good morning.
this is Jerry.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Jerry Rainingberg with the Department of Health in the state of Washington. And I really want to briefly share that all across Indian country, and I've been in this field for many, many years. And the thing that really hurts me is just always hearing about the initial statistics, the disparities, that we're the worst in this category and that one. And what about our strengths, the things that protect us, culture's prevention, for example, the sense that these traditions, our ceremonies, our tribal best practices really need to be coming to the forefront, I believe. And we have done that. We have a campaign which is statewide, and it's called Native and Strong. It's a media campaign that's based on Native voices from all across the state, all 29 tribes, urban Indian centers, all the different Native advocates who are into prevention and looking at ways in which we can really demonstrate resiliency and renewed hope using messaging, using language, using images, using our own people to demonstrate that, to lead that, and to give voice to that hope, that sense that we are here, we've been here, and we'll continue to be here. But focusing on that so that when we go out to visit our communities, we are coming from a strength-based approach.
Right.
So instead of saying, for example, trauma-informed, many colleagues of mine who are in the field are starting to say healing-informed, so that it brings the sense that we're talking about healing, where we're not going to get stuck in trauma. We're going to move forward because we've got our traditions, we've got our ceremonies, we've got our healing ways. And so let's promote those, let's enhance those, let's find ways to create environments, conditions, and opportunities for those voices to be heard that give us that hope, that give us those strengths. And so if anyone's interested, they can contact us. The website we have is nativeandstrong.org. We are also going to partner with the College Tribe in Southern Washington to have a tribal wellness gathering. And again, that whole theme is going to be around resiliency and wellness and bringing hope to our people, especially during this time. We're also going to be having and hosting a talking circle where we have a good number of tribal advocates, prevention specialists, tribal leaders speaking to state representatives and giving them an orientation, an introduction, and an invitation to bring more of our Native and tribal people into discussions, prevention efforts, treatment programs, and in all of that. So we hope that there'll be even more opportunities, not just in our state, but all across the Pacific Northwest and all across Indian country. Thank you.
Very good news, Jerry. And I really appreciate your words, because that's pretty much the grounding that Maria has in her work on historical trauma, and why she gets really concerned on the overemphasis on the trauma part of talking about historical trauma. And I look forward to learning more about you. If you get a chance in chat, put down the information that you referenced about how to get more informed about what you do. I see that here already. Thank you, Jerry. Next slide, please.
Ray, I know this has been just so amazing to have people interact and converse. It is so powerful. I just wanted to draw attention that I think we are done at 12:30. And so we have a little over 15 minutes and we do have a handful of questions. So just wanted to do a time check with you and just holler when you're ready for some questions.
Okay, we'll get through the next set. There aren't that many left, I believe. But here we're going to talk into our primary purpose about introducing this dialogue around rural mental health in Indian country. Next slide, please. Yeah, we're not going to do this till later. Go ahead. There you go. Next slide. What Jerry talked about is a really major dynamic between your American approaches to well-being, mental health, and Native American approaches to well-being, which is health, healing. And Sean Bear out of the Native American ATTC and I spent a good amount of time talking about this dynamic that exists around the Euro-American approach towards behavioral health, and how it is trauma laden and sometimes intrusive. And we compare and contrast that to the Native American perspectives on healing and our ways of doing this. So I'll put that out there. Next slide. And we get to this dynamic around what is recovery, what is healing. They're not necessarily the same thing. And it goes back to what I showed around the DSM and Native American approaches towards taking care of ourselves. Next slide. I'm really proud that one of my mentors in my learning in my career is this gentleman. If you don't know who this gentleman is, this is Dr. William Miller out of the University of New Mexico, one of the main developers of the motivational interviewing approach. And one of the little known aspects of Dr. Miller's teachings and his way is his strong interest in teaching and researching into how we in the Euro-American system can begin integrating spirituality into treatment. And he's written books and articles and studies on this. So I'd encourage you to look at Dr. Miller's references on spirituality and treatment and learn to, from him that way. So this is grounding for many people. Next slide, please. Mental wellness versus mental illness, goes back to what Jerry was talking about in terms of how we frame ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And my teachings from my elders and my healers, this is the way we're taught. We have in the Navajo tradition prayers and songs that go Najona Najona ne ya ya ne na oh ya ya Najona Najona ya ya ne na oh ya ya. Najona means beautiful, beautiful, beautiful ways, beautiful, beautiful ways. These are songs that we sing as a way to emphasize mental wellness and physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And this is how healing occurs by dealing with the traumas and that approach. Next slide, please. Native American mental well-being is described in one of the tips that was developed out of SAMHSA, tip 61. And I took an excerpt of that, out of that, to display how Native spirituality really comes around to healing ourselves from traumatic, very, very traumatic experience. I don't think in my lifetime I'll ever experience what my ancestors experienced in Lakota country, here in Navajo country. But nonetheless, as we go through the pandemic and the wars that are happening and that draw our young people into it, these are important things to keep in mind, as we move ahead to our lives. Next slide, please. Also from tip 61 is this statement. I'm not going to read it to you, but basically, we have ways in our healing processes that are contrast significantly from the DSM-based system. We have beliefs that acknowledge powers that be that are not healthy, that attempt to draw us to not being well, and we have prayers and ceremonies to do that, and ways to understand our world that way, so that we can take care of ourselves and take care of each other more strongly. Next slide, please. I'm going to reference Dr. Braveheart again, also another mentor of mine. I'm really proud that she's taken time to teach me a few things here and there as a ignorant Navajo male. She's been very guiding and teaching me some of the thoughts that she has. But I like this model because it shows indigenous or native therapeutic practices in a nice way that conveys some of what we work to do through our naming ceremonies, our listening, our watching, our voicing, our speaking, our drumming, our walks and our rides and our ceremonies and the teachings and vision seeking that we do. This is how we ground ourselves. Many of us do that. And what are the impacts of that? Well, one of the impacts of that is that although we have a good portion of our people who are substance dependent, we have a more significant proportion of native country who aren't that way. We have more abstinent Native Americans in proportion when we compare that to the general population. A lot more of our native people are living healthy lives that are good when we compare that to the general population. So so that is really important to understand, I think. It goes back to my comment about around how when we look at life on reservations and rural communities, we tend to think that life is all bad. What we don't see and don't appreciate is a significant amount of work and healing that's occurring through our indigenous practices, whether they be tradition-based or whether they be Christian-based. Next slide. We practice our beliefs, and here are images to depict, in a real funny way, what is on our roof. In many of our lands, we do have stories, teachings, beliefs, and practices geared around fending off or keeping away those beings that exist to us. Very real. And what you see on the left side or the right side of the screen is what we call the skinwalker, shapeshifter, whatever you might call it, but they have very strong presence in many parts of a native country that we respect. Next slide. In our ways, we give offerings continually, whether physically or mentally. Many of us wake up in the morning appreciating that we're here today and contemplate on how we're going to be good people, well people, and we make offerings to continue that kind of living and to take care of ourselves that way through tobacco, smudging, prayers, and offerings. Next slide. We have protective practices among our people that we employ, that we use a lot, that we live by. These protective practices begin in the homes and begin around the homes and include our relatives and our family members. I come from a society that's very extensive family base, so I have hundreds and hundreds of relatives across Navajo land that I interact with virtually or sometimes in person. And we protect each other that way. We teach each other that way through ceremony. Next slide. One of the forgotten aspects of Native American life is that historically, prior to colonization, Native people had extensive relationships across the Northern Hemisphere down into the southern lands. One of the things that the European people noticed when they came to the northeast part of the country was how predominant corn was grown in that region. Corn in the Northeast. But one of the little known historical facts is that corn developed in Central America by the Incas. So from the Incas, corn spread north and south. When the Spanish landed in South America and the Mayans developed corn. When the Spanish landed and got to the Inca lands in South America, they saw corn being cultivated. And that's an example of how wide interactions were among Native people. And fortunately, these days, we're beginning to have those kind of interactions again. Next slide. This goes back to mental health versus mental illness, framing our experiences and our interactions that way in rural Native American settings, I think is really, really important. And speaking less to mental illness and more towards mental health goes back in line to what Jerry had mentioned around healing. Next slide. So Q&A time, and contact information is here for those of you who are curious about. Oh, and for my Alaska relatives, I still have my Alaska number, so I haven't totally assimilated back into lower 48 life yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ray. We have a lot of questions, and I know we just have 4 minutes, so I'm going to try and see if we can do it maybe in 1 minute each, which is not going to do it justice at all. But someone who's asked early on, and I wanted to see how things shook out. Has the growth of telemedicine and Zoom becoming more common and available shown any improvement on access for care in your experience? I feel like a lot of folks echoed that was true in their experience, but I know there's downsides.
Well, I think that there's been a lot of variation to that, because telemedicine and telebehavioral health is still new to many, especially many of the smaller tribes that are working on that. And as today, I know that many rural Native communities have hybrid models. And one of the good things is that more and more of our people are carrying smartphones to be able to do more grounded telebehavioral health work. So I think it's an area that's still in development, and something that a lot of us are curious around furthering.
Great. Yeah. And, if the internet is there, as we've talked about, how about when, this is a complex question. So when folks in behavioral health, and sometimes in Native or Indian behavioral health programs, maybe don't acknowledge historical trauma and how disturbing that is. And so, how do you as a provider, certainly I hope they aren't saying that to clients or patients, but how do you work with folks where this is just like you aren't even on the same page about the reality of what happened?
Well, Dr. Volkov, who runs NIDA, openly talks about trauma and researches trauma. All our major researchers and the Euro-American learning centers talk about trauma. And so that's what I alluded to earlier when I said anyone who does not acknowledge trauma has a significant impact on our mental well-being is negligent, because research has validated, I think, the adverse impact of trauma upon all people, whether you're Native American or not. What we've done in Native country is taken the trauma thinking and develop it into a historical perspective. I mean, who doesn't talk about 9/11 these days? What happened over about 20 years ago. And I wouldn't doubt that people who don't appreciate historical trauma, they themselves probably talk about the impact of 9/11 on their lives. That's an historical traumatic perspective. And most Euro-Americans are here because of traumatic experiences they've had in their homelands. Today we're bringing in thousands of Ukrainians into the United States because of their traumatic experiences, and Russians also. So I think not acknowledging or appreciating Native American historical trauma is also not appreciating historical trauma of other ethnic peoples across the world.
Agreed. Yeah, I think whether it's people who've lost children to the opioid crisis or other, genocides that, I 100% agree. I think in our lands, it makes you wonder, do people not read their history? Did they not? And, some of us weren't exposed in traditional educational settings. So I think that, I think for for those of us that either, didn't have to suffer in these ways, but at least we're exposed to these realities. And you can always learn more, of course, but it's a real deficit clearly of our systems, and these silent sufferings that should really be clearly known, and it's not over. Anyway, we could go on and on, but I know we're over time. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We will try to capture the last question around healing, and certainly I know there's got to be research around peyote and other healing practices, so we can get that from you. And I am happy to put my contact information in the chat, because I definitely would love to connect with some of you, because we at the Northwest MHTTC are always wanting to do more and do better. And this was our first step in trying to connect with your center. And we really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for everyone's time today. And Ray, just really, really grateful to have spent this time with you today.
I appreciate all of you, and bless you for joining us today. And take care of yourselves, and treat each other with respect and love and caring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll leave this open, the room open for just a few minutes. I'll hop off video, but that way folks can grab things. Not sure about the copying from the chat, but we generally try to put a resource page together, and this one will have a lot of things because you had a lot of things in your presentation, and I grabbed some things that you mentioned. So we'll make sure we'll comb through this. It might take a couple weeks, but we'll get all of our stuff and make people can see the resources that you mentioned. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Good things take time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.